So another performance tip, not all styles are created equal. Shadows are expensive. They're very expensive. The higher you turn up that blur number, the more expensive they get. So if you want a surefire way to slow your layout down to a crawl, put shadows on everything, every object. I don't recommend doing that. Especially on mobile devices, they're really, really slow. In fact, they're slow that we won't even turn them on. If you've noticed on Go, shadows only show up in certain situations. They show up for the focus state, they show up for popovers, and that's it. They're not fast enough, they're not performant enough for us to turn them on for every layout object. And you'll find the same thing on the web as well. If you overuse shadows, you will bring your web browser to a crawl. Gradients are another thing, used sparingly. If you need a gradient, use a gradient. But don't say, oh, gradients are bad, I'm just going to replace it with a big bitmap image. That's not a good idea. But some interesting thing about gradients is the orientation of the gradient can matter. Linear gradients that are perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical, we can take some optimizations with those and they become faster. So if you've got gradients and you have a 1 degree angle on them or a 2 degree angle on them, I think about maybe making them horizontal or vertical. Go for 0, 90, 180, 270. The other thing, radial gradients are a little bit slower, and I avoid putting gradients on big objects. We have to do more work the larger the object is. So if you do notice your layout is a little bit slow and you've got big layout objects with big gradients in them, try playing around with turning those off and on and see what kind of difference it makes. The other thing that you got to watch out for is you can put images in the background of any layout object now. If you pick a 30 megapixel image, we'll use it. Your user will have to download that 30 megapixel image whenever they load that layout. Hopefully it'll be cached after the first time, but that first load is going to take a while. My recommendation for images for objects is either go with a sliced image, where you can take a small image and expand it up to fill any size object, or if you need to use a full-size image, only make the image twice as large as the object is. So if your object is 50 points by 50 points, make the image background 100 pixels by 100 pixels. The reason I recommend you double it is for Retina devices. Otherwise, layouts will tend to look a little bit fuzzy. They won't look high fidelity. It's not a great experience. Yes? What's that? I'll have to get back to you on that. I think, so the question was, what's the resolution for looking at data in a container? I believe we grab the bits that we need. So if you're on a Retina device, we ask for 144 dpi. And if the image is bigger than that, we'll generate a thumbnail and we'll only pull down the size that we need. But I know that's not all. There may be some exceptions for that. I wish Oleg was here. He has a great session. I think there's a recording of it from last year about containers. And he goes into great depth about exactly how they work, about how all the thumbnailing works. So I recommend you check that out. So that's what I got for performance and layout objects. And now I want to move on to styles and themes. And we're going to start out with a review. So this is all stuff that applies equally to FileMaker 12 and FileMaker 13. So a style is just a collection of attributes. They tell us everything we need to know about how to draw something. And a style is what we refer to in the computing terminology a map. So that just means that to get a value out of this map, you have to give us a key. And there's 3 keys required for a style. The first key is a component. We talked a little bit about components. Popovers, the inner content area is a component of the popover. For slide panels, the dots are components. The content area of the slide control is a component. So what I've got up here is a field, it's a pop-up field. And these objects don't have a lot of components. There's just 4. There's the self component, which is where we draw the border and the fill. There's the inner border component, which we use for some legacy styles like engrave and emboss. There's the text component, which, you guessed it, draws the text. And there's the icon component. Some other objects have lots of components. Tab controls have more than 4 components. They have quite a few more than 4 components, actually. So for this reason, some objects require more style information than others. And also for this reason, you can't always take a style from one object and move it to another one willy-nilly. Because if you take information about the style from a field and try to put it in a tab control, you're going to style the self inner border, but there's no style information there for the panel inner border. Next one of our keys is states. And states are, when an object gets into a certain situation, it'll draw in a different state. When your mouse is over an interactive object, it draws in the hover state. When you click into a field, it draws in the focus state. We have more than 4 states. Some objects have different states. You'll see them in the inspector. And sometimes we'll refer to the same state as 2 different things depending on the object type. But the important thing to understand is they're there, they can be styled. The last part of our key is a property. And properties are things like border color, border style, width, fill. We've got a lot of properties. In fact, I can't fit them all on this slide. We have, I think, over 100 properties. And those are all the different things that tell us everything we need to know about how to draw your object. So that's what makes a style. Styles live in 3 places. Was there a question? What's that? So the question is, styles do not contain sizes, or styles do not correct sizes. What's inside, styles do contain things like sizes. So border width is a size. Border width can be specified by our themes in pixels. Some properties we specify in relative sizes. So things like padding. We don't use a point value for padding. We use something called an M, or an EM, or I don't know how to pronounce it. But what that is it's a percentage of the font size. So as you make the font bigger, the padding gets bigger. The inspector, however, always sets things in points. So you'll notice after you've fidgeted with a value in the inspector, it's not going to have that dynamic quality anymore, like the theme would by default. So local styles are when you change an object with the inspector. Those go into the local styles of an object. Theme styles come from the theme you choose with your layout. And then the initial value is if neither the local style nor the theme style says what to do, we use the defaults put in the CSS3 spec. The reason we do that is for great compatibility with IWP. So we want to make sure that whatever FileMaker spits out and we go to IWP, if we don't specify a property, we need to have the same result. So WebDirect, I'm sorry. Old habits die hard. So local styles, I talked about those a second. You can see here I've got an object selected. It's a field. It has no local changes. And you can tell that by looking at the inspector where it says style, it says default. It's not red. There's no red arrow next to it. There's no asterisk. That means this object has 0 in the way of local styles. When I use the inspector to change things, that local style starts to fill up. So in this case, I've changed the fill, and I've changed the border color. Interesting thing about styles, they're what we call a sparse collection. So when there's nothing in the style, it takes up 0 space. So before I made this modification, the local style was very, very small. Now it's gotten a little bit bigger. If I change more properties, it gets bigger still. It doesn't have to specify all the properties. So as you can see here, this object has got a fill and stroke locally, but the inspector is telling us about the border width. The border width is 1 point. It has a corner radius. The corner radius is 0. That information has got to come from somewhere. And that's one of the other places the styles live, is themes. So every layout is associated with a theme. A theme contains a style for every type of visual element. You notice I didn't say layout object. Themes contain information not just about all the different types of layout objects, but also all the different types of parts. So they're a little bit more than just for objects. Themes in 12 and later are not like themes that you knew before in FileMaker 11 and earlier. The themes that we had there were chosen at the beginning of the process of creating a layout, and they specified the initial value for all the styling for the object, but it wasn't persistent. You couldn't change it after the fact. It just kind of set them up initially, and it was done. Our new themes in FileMaker 12 and 13, they're persistent. If you change the theme, it'll change the way all your objects look that use that theme. So now that we know about themes, it might make a little bit more sense where that 1 point border width is coming from. The theme says it. The theme says that borders should be 1 point. But still, where's radius coming from? And that's where those initial values come from. Well, that's where those initial values come into play. So if neither the local style nor the theme tell us what to do, we go back to those CSS3 initial values, and in this case, it's 0. So when we go to actually draw, we have to cascade through all these values. This is the process we go through when we're evaluating every object to see how does this draw. So right now I've got an object selected. It's a vanilla field, has no local changes. So when we go to draw that object, when we're trying to figure out the fill color, first we look locally. There's nothing there. We cascade down to the next level, and we look in the theme instead. Stroke, same story. Width, also, same thing. Radius, nothing in the theme either. So then we go back down to the initial value. When you've got local styles, that's the first place we check. We find a value. We stop looking. The theme no longer matters. The initial value no longer matters. The local style wins out. Do the same thing for stroke in this example. Width, nothing there. We go down to the theme. And radius cascades down to the initial value. So, what about states? States are a little bit interesting because not only do they cascade from local to theme, but states will also cascade from state to state. So in this example, our hover is not really periwinkled, but it's close. I'm using a hypothetical example. I've gone to the hover state in the inspector, and I can see that by default, that hover state is that kind of purplish color. When we go to draw that object, first we look, are there any local modifications to the hover state? No. Then we go to the theme, and we ask the theme, do you have any information about the fill color for the hover state? And that's where we find that value, and that's why we see that in the inspector and when you bring your mouse over that object. So let's say that I go and I use the inspector to change it from the pink color to the blue color. Now we introduce a property to the local style, but not in the normal state, in the hover state. So when we cascade, we find it there. I've gone back in the inspector in this example, and I've changed the normal state line color to green. If I change back to the hover state, you can see the line color still green. I didn't change the hover state's line color, but because of cascading, what you do to the normal state affects the hover state. So as we cascade down through these styles for stroke, we look in the hover state, we don't find any information about the stroke color in the hover state, neither in theme nor in local. So then we go back to the normal state, we look locally for that, we find green, so we use it. Okay. All right, so let's talk again about performance. When we're talking about styles and performance, the thing to remember is styling light is styling right. The less local styles you have, the smaller the style is for that object. And while it doesn't make a huge difference for one layout object, it can make a big difference as you start talking about 10 layout objects, 20 layout objects, 100, 1,000. It can make a big difference. So if you want to avoid less local styles, you do that by not deviating from the themes unless you can help it. That was a little bit hard to do in FileMaker 12. You'd kind of just choose a theme that was as close to what you wanted as you could, and then you just deviate where you need to. We've given you a much better way to deal with this in FileMaker 13, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So when you convert a solution, it uses the classic theme. And the classic theme is very simple. It says every object has a white background and a one-point black border. I'm guessing that your converted solutions don't all look like that. You've probably done a lot of styling. You've changed the way they've looked. You've used one of our themes, not new themes, but old themes, to give your objects a more rich appearance. All the appearance information about all of your objects are then stored in the local styles, so they're kind of fat. They're big. So classic I avoid, especially for performance. If you notice a layout going slow and it's using the classic theme, try applying a different theme to it. Get rid of those local styles, slim down that layout, and see what kind of difference it makes. You should keep states simple too. They will also kind of bloat up your style. And then one thing that's really troublesome for us is when you take an object from one layout using theme A, you copy it and you paste it to another layout using theme B. When you do this, we want the object in the new layout to look just like it did in the old layout, but we have to fight against the theme. So for that reason, when you do this kind of operation, we have to take all the theme styles, all the local styles, we merge them together, and then in the new layout, where that new object comes in, we put all of those styles in the local styles. So you can wind up with situations like this, where the local styles are completely full. Every property has got a value in it for the local styles. And like I said, styles are sparse. So instead of being very small, your local styles become very big. We've done something in FileMaker 13 to make this a little bit better. It's still not great because we still need to keep track of all those places that are different. But if you do wind up in a situation in FileMaker 13 where the local style and the theme style match, when you save that layout, we'll go through and we'll clean it up. So here's an example of how style normalization works. You can see that the fill, the stroke, the width, they all agree between local and theme. For that reason, you don't really need any of those local styles. If you open up a layout in FileMaker 13 and then save it, we'll do this step for you automatically. So actually, I guess that's another performance top tip. Oh, happy about that. Good to hear it. All you got to do is open that layout and save it. We won't go and do it for you automatically just because we don't know if we can adjust your layouts. We don't know if you have the privileges to change all the layouts. So you don't get this until you actually open and save that layout. But it can make a big difference. I was playing around with one layout where I had a lot of objects that were copied and pasted from another. And they match pretty closely. And the size of the styles in that layout went down by like 95%. That's a big change.